Right-wing revisionists always try to water down the philosophy of the American Revolution, and for the most part, they have succeeded. This is why many are surprised to find out that most of the Founding Fathers could be considered proto-socialist for their ideas. Thomas Jefferson, for example, believed every American should be given a plot of land and the resources to make that land productive, and that the government should be as small as possible. A similar thinker, today I'll be giving a surface overview of Common Sense by Thomas Paine. This is the pamphlet that history classes say sparked the masses into action after the shot heard round the world. I'm not here to critique history, so I'll let that stand for now. But I'll say my goal here is to give a brief overview of his work and its contents, and encourage you to read it for yourself and look into other works by Paine. Common Sense is a great entry point to his work, as most people are familiar with it, at least an idea. But most people may not be familiar with just how anti-imperialist it is. And Paine has more radical works, such as Agrarian Justice opposed to agrarian law and to agrarian monopoly, which Common Sense could act as a sort of gateway drug to. So then, what is Common Sense? The pamphlet is split into 4 main sections and an appendix. The first section is really an unnamed section and an introduction, but I count them together. This part sets up his argument and some definitions he uses later. The second, of the monarch and hereditary succession, he succinctly breaks down the uselessness and injustice of monarchy. In the third section, Thoughts on the Present State of American Affairs, he discusses why America should be independent from Britain and later lays out how the American government should be formed. Of the present ability of America, with some miscellaneous reflections, he mostly discusses how America could defeat Britain with calculations of army sizes and costs. And then after that is the appendix, in which he concludes a few extra arguments and also discusses why the Quakers should join the American Revolution. Now, Paine begins his first section by delineating society and government. He says that society is produced by our wants and government by our wickedness. And because of this, society pursues happiness while the government acts to restrict people who would do bad. I think this is a great way to start out and is relevant, even though, as often when socialists criticize government, people will retort that they just hate society, which is not true. While we hate the American government, we love the American people. And here, Thomas Paine wants us to make sure we understand that, though he despises the monarchy, he loves the British people and believes they should form an independent state where the people have power rather than a monarch. After making this distinction, Paine gives his philosophy on how government arises, and he envisions it as a funnel towards autocracy. He sees first a short state of nature where humans realize they can't survive alone, so they gravitate together in order to build shelter together and give each other medical assistance. This then forms a state of anarchy, where all can do as they please. But soon, he says, people will begin to act selfishly, and a direct democracy will have to form in order to create informal regulations that ensure people treat each other fairly. But as the population increases, it becomes logistically impossible to have every person present at once to decide on regulations. So a republic is formed. This allows for a smaller group of elected representatives to decide on matters on the community's behalf. And this works, Paine believes, because the elected need to keep their electors happy, or else they lose power. He will not say how the monarchy forms until later, but I believe he leaves us on this note because this is the form of government he sees as best working. Next, he criticizes the English Constitution, and he highlights the absurdity of the philosophy behind the English government. He claims that defendants will often cite that the monarchy is at least better than it once was now that it's no longer absolutist, but he also explains that, at least under absolutism, the people knew who was at fault when something was wrong. The mixed government system is now so convoluted that no one can tell what is working and what is in need of fixing. And I see a lot of parallels here with our modern society. The government we have now is so full of checks and balances that really only serve to complicate passing laws and create gridlock. His argument, I feel, can also be applied to many different political scenarios. For example, people will say civil rights doesn't need to be talked about anymore because at least people aren't owned as slaves anymore. At least we aren't still living under separate but equal. But then the real problem is that, at least back then, people were openly racist. they could be called out on their racism. We knew what the issue was. But nowadays, racism has become so convoluted. There are dog whistles and quote-unquote colorblind systems in place to make it harder to see, harder to actually address, harder to make progress. So then, Paine sees this mixed government as one that clashes and produces worse outcomes. He also sees a problem in the idea that the government can mix, pointing out that the House of Commons and King being pitted as a system to check and balance each other makes no sense. He points out that if the House of Commons acts as a check on the king, then the system presumes people are wiser and more trustworthy than the king. It presumes that the king would be evil if unchecked, so then why is there a king? And yet, the king also acts as a check for the people. But this again presumes the opposite, that the king is better than the people and the people would be evil without the king. It creates an absurd circle where both sides are worse and better than the other. He then proposes an end to this circle. He sees Britain as more free than the rest of the world, and he points out that this is not because of the king. Everywhere else has kings. But freedom comes from the restrictions put on the king. So then, if there was no king, there would only be more freedom for the people. Of the monarchy and hereditary succession. The next section focuses on the immorality of monarchy as a system. And he begins it with a biblical argument, which I wasn't initially expecting. It is nice to remember that Christianity can be used for anti-authoritarian aims, and many religions are far more socialist in thought than conservative politicians have allowed them to be interpreted as in the modern world. I won't try to analyze the argument he makes here, as I myself am not religious, but from what I understand, it seems a poignant argument, and I recommend any Christians closely read this section, as you will likely get much more out of it than I could. After this, he finally describes how a monarchy comes about. He visualizes 3 ways in which a kingship can start. A king can either be chosen by lottery, by election, or by a coup. Under these options, hereditary rule is injustice for the first 2, as a second ruler should also be decided by the same process. And for the last, he deems it ignoble. I won't go into too much detail because I'm sure most of us in America who are familiar with common sense already understand the problems with monarchy, but this section gives a good summation of the arguments against it for those who haven't considered the issue deeply. So I do recommend reading it closely. And for socialists, much of what Paine says here has parallels with our own society. Companies and jobs run more of people's lives nowadays than governments do. Every day we go into work to join an autocracy, while we only participate in democracy maybe once a year. Modern billionaires are just kings of another name, unelected, and essentially winning power by lottery or by usurping it, with capital and politics rather than violence. And yet, we allow them hereditary rule. The number one predictor of wealth, after all, is whether or not you're born into it. And in our democracy, statisticians have found 0 correlation between public opinion and law, but a near 1-to-1 correlation between corporate opinion and government policy. So, kings by another name. Divine rule by kings was once seen as immutable, and now so is corporate rule. We banished the kings once, and we can do it again. Unless you're the British, goddamn. Thoughts on the present state of American affairs. I won't go into too much detail in this section as it is less philosophical and more technical. He lays out his ideal independent American government with a mix of autocracy and elections. His system is also much more parliamentary, with a Congress electing the president. The next part of this section is also highly anti-imperialist, as he discusses how Britain exploits its colonies and controls other nations, not out of a sense of helping them, as defenders claim, but for profit. This also tracks pretty neatly onto America's imperial project. However, nowadays it is, much as Paine bemoans, more convoluted and more difficult to fight against, as imperialism takes the form of foreign aid and funding terrorist groups rather than direct intervention. Paine takes a very pro-independence and shockingly pro-immigration stance, stating that states should be allowed to interact with one another freely without the intervention of anyone else. Here we also finally see some proto-socialist thought, as he says all men should own property. While it's often pointed out in progressive circles that the Founding Fathers once only wanted landowning white men to vote, it's interesting to see here that Paine, at least, thought everyone should be given land, so then everyone would be able to vote. Of course, considering the time period, he didn't consider women or minorities, but it's still far more democratic than the America we got. The Founding Fathers really believed that if everyone was given the same starting point, they would have the ability to make something of themselves. Now, like I said, there were 2 other sections to this book, but the last one is highly technical and mostly just discusses how war with Britain would play out, and then an appendix which in large part was a plea to the Quakers to help the revolutionaries out. I'm more focused on the philosophy of the revolution and its anti-imperialism, so I'll leave those for anyone to read on their own. But before I finish this off, I will give a brief reminder that Thomas Paine was not perfect, and he was a product of his time. He, of course, uses the familiar language of referring to men when discussing the rights of the citizenry, and likely he meant it to only apply to men. He also states that America is European, and his stance on immigration seems to only apply to people coming from Europe, as later on he also appears to quote someone with a similar stance to the modern Great Replacement conspiracy theory. His view for American government is also flawed. Despite talking about the absurdity of checks against the people, he sets up a republic with a bicameral legislature to check the people, and a president the people don't even elect. And, as we know, America eventually ended up with a Senate and a House, with the House being elected by the people and, originally, the Senate representing the states, not the people. It's also worth mentioning that part of the reason Paine saw Britain as the most free nation is that the majority of the world at the time was still under direct colonization, though I'm sure he was just comparing to other European countries. But it is sad to say there were likely many other forms of government and thought that couldn't even be considered because all he could see were parliaments and monarchies. And I think this limited point of view, which is no fault of his own, of course, like us, was a product of his time. But with hindsight, we know now that a republic, too, can be turned tyrannical. Overall, Common Sense was a great read. Paine lays out his arguments clearly and simply, and it can be easily read despite its age. It gives a lot of insight into how people thought at the time, and it can also work well as a short bridge to more radical works of his. Definitely give this one a read.